This video presents a demonstration of the use of CyberRisk Guardian as a tool to help organizations create a cybersecurity risk assessment. So the idea is to try to automate the process as much as possible to help organizations deal with making these assessments. So in this particular example, I've already created a use case, which I will provide a link to in the description. And I've prepared queries already, which I'm going to be running here. So what I'm basically going to be doing is copying and pasting in these queries. Again, the link to those will be available in the description of the video on YouTube. So the first thing is to provide CyberRisk Guardian with some context. So here I'm pasting in the context information. So I'm basically telling it that I'm a senior cybersecurity risk analyst and I'm working for an IT consulting firm. I was hired by the customer to help them out doing this risk assessment. So I've just pasted in the information. I'm going to leave ChatGPT the time to digest this. It'll take a few minutes, or a few seconds, I should say, and it's coming right back now and providing the answer to this query. So once I've done that, I'm going to be providing information about the organization. So in this particular case, I'm using a healthcare organization here in Quebec, in my neighborhood actually, and it's the integrated social health and social services organization. So those are the local neighborhood health organizations here in Quebec. And I'm also going to be attaching to that a whole bunch of documents that I've downloaded online. They're basically annual reports and different reports that have been produced by this public healthcare organization, which are published on their website. So as you can, I already did that before. Of course, if you wanted to do this for a real organization, you would need to provide this information, considering that you probably would have this available in-house, obviously. Now, while it's loading this, I would like to point out that I'm using a public organization. The information is available easily, and this is using a public or a ChatGPT, a custom setup that I've developed. However, if you wanted to do this for a real organization, obviously you wouldn't want to use this on the public ChatGPT providing this information. So you'd want to use a private generative AI type of setup. And here as well, it finished loaded the information, so now I'm running the query. And I would like to point out that this was designed, in this example, was designed to be used with my cybersecurity students, in which I'm teaching in a governance and risk management for cybersecurity course. Of how they could do this and how they could use generative AI as a tool using a methodology that I use in class with my students. In the real world scenario, you would probably want to use your own methodology or a commercially available methodology that you've acquired. So now it's loading in the information. It's loaded all this data. So I'm going to go to the next step, and I'm going to do. So what I'm going to do now is, based on the information that was provided, I'm now going to ask ChatGPT to provide an estimate of the risk appetite of the organization. So I want to know what's going to be the value that's going to evaluate for this, and that's going to be used in the next steps, in which I'm actually going to be performing a scenario-based risk assessment. So again, here it's going to take a few seconds. It's coming back, starting to provide the answer already. And what is it saying? So It's going a little slow. Obviously, I'm doing this during the day. I'm not the only person using this ChatGPT, so as you can see, it takes a little bit of time. The other thing as well, it might happen in the demo that sometimes it will stop, it's running out of resources, and it will ask me to regenerate or to run my query again. So if this happens, well, I'll let you know. I think we might get lucky today, but that wouldn't be unusual that it would do that. So now it's coming up with a highly risk averse, so a value of 0.1. They were using this on the scale of 1 to 0. And because I know this organization, I'm familiar with what they're doing, my feeling is 0.1 is actually probably a little bit too high, too risk averse. And so I'm going to want to correct that. So so it's choosing 0.1 to guide the risk assessment. I'm going to provide some additional information here as soon as it's finished. It shouldn't be too long now. Okay, so now I'm going to come back and I'm going to say to ChatGPT, I think this is a bit too extreme as a value. I would prefer that you revise this and use 0.3 as a more value. So again, here you can, obviously provide feedback if some of the information doesn't match what you had been expected or what seems reasonable. In this case, as I said, I think it's perhaps a little bit too high of a value. That would be a highly risk averse, so indicating a very low risk appetite. I think in this case it would be appropriate to be risk averse, but perhaps not to that level. There you go. So it's saying, yeah, okay, so that might be a little bit too conservative, so let's adjust it to 0.3. So then the next step, once this has been concluded, is going to be to create some summary scenarios. So we're basically going to be creating a bunch of high-level scenarios with a minimal description of these scenarios that we're going to want to use further. So if we were doing a real risk assessment for an organization or in the context of a classroom exercise, we'd be doing either 10 or 20 scenarios and evaluating the risk based on all of these scenarios. In this particular example, we're going to create 20 summary scenarios, so basically high-level risk scenarios. So we're asking ChatGPT to create 20. We could create more, 20, 30, 50. When you try to do more than 20, typically what happens is it gives you even more shorter descriptions of the scenarios. So I found that 20 is a good number. However, if I needed more than 20, I could generate multiple iterations, multiple times 20. I've actually run a whole bunch of tests with this, and I even created some Python scripts or RStudio scripts that use the OpenAI API. And in one case, I've even went up to like 5,000 scenarios over a long period, obviously, to generate all of these. to try to experiment. So the possibility of using a very high number of scenarios for risk assessments. Of course, that's probably way too extreme, but still, do consider that 20 scenarios is probably closer to what a real organization with a low level of maturity in cybersecurity risk assessments might want to use in the real world. And creating 20 risk scenarios is something that would normally take several weeks to do. And here we've created a summary, so we've basically in the real world, we'd be running meetings and doing research, try to generate all of these. And here, what we've done is we've created 20 scenarios in a matter of a couple minutes. And when you look at these scenarios, you can see that, well, actually, these make sense, right? So, for example, phishing, ransomware, insider threat, distributed denial of service, number 5. These are actually make a lot of sense of the kind of things that we could be using. Now here, just for sake of expediency, I've actually already created a scenario, so I'm gonna actually want to use this scenario. So I'm gonna just add this scenario, and I'm gonna do this as an intermediate query. I'm gonna say, okay, I'm gonna ask you to consider this risk scenario. So this one is a ransomware attack on the healthcare systems for the same organization. So this just to speed things up in the context of doing this demo. So I'm just gonna inject this in which in the real world, again, we could have some top-down or a bottom-up approach. So basically create our own scenarios based on the mission and strategy of the organization, or we could use some generic scenarios. And this might be an example of injecting into the mix a generic scenario, perhaps from COBIT or from a standard or from a best practices guide. So here we've injected this scenario in there. And for the rest of the demo, we are going to be using this scenario. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a detailed scenario. Just going to let this finish here for a second. All right. So now it's going ahead and doing this. So now I'm going to provide another query in just a minute, just a second. And okay, there we go. So now it's finished. So now I'm going to create a detailed scenario, again here using the query. So I'm going to have a query prepared to how to write the detailed scenario. I'm also going to be documenting, starting to document some of the metrics. So the metrics that I'm going to be looking at here are the list of stakeholders, the background information, detailed description. But in the metrics, where are they here in my? So the CVSS score. You're going to see them pop up here in a second. So now it's just doing the description of the scenario, coming up with some mitigation measures, identifying the stakeholders. Here we go. Now we're getting into the metrics. So the probability of the threat being present, the probability of exploitation of the vulnerability by the threat, the expected damages. So normally what would be the damages that we would expect to happen here? What's the worst case scenario? So the maximum damages, the level of resilience of the organization, the expected utility. So how much does the things involved in this scenario contribute to wealth creation in the organization? Then it's estimating the CVSS score. So in this case, 9.0, which would be a critical vulnerability. Then it's coming up with a list of mitigation measures and estimating a cost for these, and then looking at the impact that these measures would have as to dealing to mitigating the risk. So on that basis, what I'm going to want to do now is to calculate the key risk indicators. So basically, I'm going to import here the how to use all these metrics, and so I'm providing. Oh, I just made a mistake here. Sorry. Let me just make sure I copy in the right thing. There we go. So calculating the key risk indicators. So I'm just running this query. So I'm calculating the key risk indicators, the estimated risk, the tolerated risk, the mitigated risk, and the residual risk. So now it's using the data that was generated previously, and on that basis doing the analysis. So this is the step where sometimes when you run this query, it doesn't actually work on the first trial. There's a lot going on, obviously, here in the background in order to run these. And keep in mind that, you know, in the custom GPT, I've included all of the data on how to calculate these things. And also in my query, I've provided a lot of information because, you know, in ChatGPT, the more specific you are, and the more fine-tuned you've managed, you've engineered the prompt, the better the result is going to be. And so there's been a lot of, you know, trial and error done, and a lot of investigation done before we got to this point. This is still a work in progress, and it's part of a ongoing research project. But still, what we have here is actually at this point, which is why I'm publishing this and providing the video, it's actually working pretty well. So as a proof of concept, I think it was very successful. It demonstrates that this is something that, you know, can be done and works pretty well. So as you can see, it's taking a little bit of time here because there's a lot that's being done, and we're just going to hang on. It's getting close to the end of the analyzing. Oh, looks like it worked. If we're lucky, it'll work on the first trial, producing the results. And, you know, if for some reason it freezes, as it sometimes not freezes, but provides an error, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video. I'm just going to run it. You know, sometimes it takes 2-3 times before it works. But so far so good. So it's running it's calculated the estimated risk. So this is an indicator, right? It's not an actual like a dollar value or something like that. It's a relative value. And if we're going to be running this on multiple scenarios, 20 in the exercise that I'm including in this demo, I'm only doing it for one. In the real world, you know, I'd want to run this multiple times and then generate the data for each scenario. And then I'd be comparing all the different scenarios to try to come up with a plan of what I would want to do. So here I have these calculations. So it actually ran on the first trial. It looks like I'm getting good at this. I've actually broken down what used to be a much more complicated query into smaller queries, which is why I have multiple still to run. So in the next one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to explain and justify these numbers. So I'm going to ask it for a justification. And, you know, in my courses, this is something that I ask students to do. But also I find that in the real world, management or whoever you're doing this risk assessment for, they're going to want to have some explanations. They're going to want to have some justification of, you know, what is these numbers? What does it mean? How can we interpret this, and how can we use this information? So I think this is a pretty important part of the process to make this useful in the real world. So now it's doing all of this, and, you know, you're more than welcome to pause the video later on and come back and look at it. I'm not going to read everything here. I'm trying to keep this video down to, you know, not too much, not too long. So I'm not going to just be reading everything. You can read that on your own. So now it's coming up with some information, some recommendations, and it's, we want to have a balanced approach, so it's indicating some things for that as well. And now finally, in the last step, what I'm going to want to do is then I'm going to put all of this information in the form of a table, which I'm going to be able to incorporate into an Excel spreadsheet. So now it's actually doing that. So it's creating using all of the previously generated information. And as I said, we'd be doing this for 20 scenarios. So with this last part, starting with the detailed scenario query, that would need to be executed for every single scenario that you want to use. We've created 20. Maybe we just want to use 10. We'd select 10 that seem the most interesting out of those 20. Maybe we can combine, because there's similar scenarios, so maybe we'd want to combine 2 or 3 together to end up with 12 or 15. Maybe we want to do it for 100 scenarios. That's always a possibility as well. So it's processed the information, and we should be putting this into a table, and it's giving me the table as a CSV file. I could actually be a lot more specific, but I can definitely just click on this and download the CSV file and incorporate that into another document. So basically now we've run this risk assessment for this scenario, and we can now use this information and understand the information and look at the recommendations. So there you go. So I invite you to look in the video description for links to all of the material that supports this. Thank you.